So we're going to talk about clean and unclean and these ritual purity laws. Okay, so clean and unclean. It can be a matter, it's Halloween today. Happy Halloween. I love orange. I forgot to put orange on today. But anyway, and you know what I love about Halloween? Chocolate. Chocolate. It's my vitamins. When my kids were little, I would tell them that's my medicine. That's mom's medicine. Okay, clean and unclean. It can be a matter of great importance to us, but it can also be a matter of differing definitions. For example, clean in a chemistry lab means it's free of contamination. But clean in a college setting has various meanings, some dubious. For example, when my son was in college, he shared a house with 11 other guys. And clean there meant that if the dishes and pans in the sink didn't have fuzzy green mold on it, it was clean. A quick swirl of tepid water restored it to full use. But thankfully, that's not the definition used for an operating room and surgical tools where sterilization is required in order to be deemed clean. Typically today, when we hear unclean, we, or at least I do, think of something as dirty or unhygienic. But in Leviticus, unclean means something altogether different. In the ancient Near East, these purity laws were symbols of life and death, of constantly living at the border of life and death. And it was a reminder to the Israelites that they were living outside Eden in a world that's not how it's supposed to be. In the Old Testament, the ordinary state of most things was clean. But a person or thing could contract ritual uncleanness or impurity in a variety of ways: by skin disease, discharges of bodily fluid, touching something dead, or eating unclean foods. And I think there's a tendency when we read in the Old Testament of something being unclean to equate it as being sinful. But an unclean status didn't necessarily mean sin was involved. For example, giving birth, having a skin disease, or touching a dead animal may have rendered a person unclean, but in these cases there wasn't anything sinful about it. In the Old Testament, then, unclean had a different meaning, and it's important that we understand that being unclean in the Old Testament affected one's walk with God, and we'll dig deeper into that in a few minutes. It's one of the prominent themes of this book, because we know the point of having the tabernacle was so the Israelites could draw near to God again, a kind of Eden before the fall. Because of that, it's important we understand the meaning of clean and unclean as it's used in the Old Testament and its application for us in the New Testament. And so today we begin the third section. We come to the third stage and badge in our study of Leviticus, looking at chapters 11 through 15, which detail the laws about ritual purity, clean and unclean, describing what causes it and how to cure it in God's prescribed way. Okay, so where we left off in Leviticus last time was day 8, the day of new beginnings. And we'd had the ordination ceremony, and the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites in the form of fire, and the people fell on their faces and shouted. And we saw that this was the goal of all the sacrifices and cleansing, for mankind to be able to draw near to God again, to again be able to dwell in God's presence as his treasured possession, a type of Eden restored. But then, later that same day, Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, go into the tabernacle that had just been consecrated, had been sanctified, had been set apart as holy, and they offered unauthorized fire, which wasn't at all what the Lord had commanded. And so he sent fire, consuming them both inside the tabernacle. And God's fire, which had been a blessing and demonstration of his glory at the beginning of day 8, by the end of the day was now delivered on judgment, as judgment on these two priests who had presumed on God's presence and mercy. And so the newly cleansed sanctuary is now filled. It's now filled with contamination of sin and death. And these two priests, these two representatives who were called to reflect the holiness of God, who were set apart to serve the Lord, did the very opposite. They did what was right in their own eyes, and they defiled God's holy dwelling. The very ones who were to ensure God's sanctuary and people didn't profane him by defiling his dwelling with their ritual impurity did just that. So God in his mercy addressed this in Leviticus 10, where he said to Aaron, "You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the unclean and the clean." And so we see it's the priest's responsibility to teach the Israelites how to distinguish between various ritual states, the clean, the unclean, and the holy, and especially how to address their ritual impurity. So chapter 11 begins with, "And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron." And now let me stop and just say that this is significant because normally God spoke to Moses, but now he's speaking to both Moses and Aaron. Why? Because Aaron is the ordained great high priest, and as our Aaron Bethany said 2 weeks ago, it's the priest who will declare whether something is clean or unclean. And this is a major responsibility of the priest, and it carries potentially high stakes, life and death in some cases. So it's right that Aaron would be addressed as well as Moses. To have priests who would dedicate their lives to the interpretation and application of God's law was as much as a gift as the law itself. Because Israel was to look upon the law as a gift and not a burden. And so because the law was going to aid them in their covenant relationship. And so having these priests shepherd the nation in ritual and moral purity was a mercy. In our reading today, we find first the land creatures, the animals that are on the earth. And then we find the water creatures, those that live in the water. And finally, we have the birds and flying creatures. And not coincidentally, we have the same three basic distinctions found in Genesis 1, where God created all life that is in the heavens, on earth, and in the waters. Those three categories are all dealt with, and creatures that are in those categories are defined as being either clean or unclean, according to God's definitions. So first, I'm going to discuss the land animals. There are two requirements which must be met before a land animal can be considered clean and therefore eaten by the Israelites. It has to have a split hoof, and it must chew the cud. Is it hoof or hoof? I don't know. It's going to keep changing throughout this. It cannot just be one of those. It must be both. Split hoof is a hoof that's completely divided. So example of these land animals are cattle, sheep, and goats, but not horses because their hoof isn't completely split. Now, cud chewing. What does that mean? We've likely all heard cows chew their cud, but we also probably know that cows have multiple stomachs. So is this what is meant by that? No. Scholars believe it means to chew their food finely, to chew it well. Now, we have two dogs, and they're not cud chewers. One in particular just inhales her food, which can't produce much enjoyment, and it definitely disqualifies her from being a cud chewer. And interestingly, cud-chewing land animals are vegetarian, chewing their non-meat, leafy food well. But if they don't have a split hoof and they're unclean, they fail the two-prong test. Herd and flock animals meet both qualifications, as do some more game animals like deer. All split-hoofed, cud-chewing land animals are clean, and therefore the Israelites can eat them. By contrast, the pig and camel are both split-hoofed, but they don't chew the cud. Because they only meet one requirement, they were deemed unclean, and the Israelites couldn't eat them. The second category of animals are the animals of the sea. In order to be considered clean, they also have two qualifications. They must have fins and scales. Only those that have fins and scales would be clean and therefore fit to be eaten by the Israelites. That means sea creatures like eel, shrimp, and lobster would be deemed unclean and therefore not to be eaten. The third category of animals are animals of the air. This includes a list of 20 or so different flying creatures. Scholars note that many of the Hebrew terms used here are very rare, and less than half can be identified with any certainty. But the original audience would have understood all the terms and known which ones they were to detest as a source of food. Additionally, unlike the other two categories of creatures, no qualifications here are given. That is, an animal of the air doesn't have to have 2 wings or a forked tail to be deemed clean. Rather, it seems as though those creatures in the air that are clean are those that aren't carnivorous or vulture-like. And by that I mean they're not sitting around waiting for something to die to eat it with its lifeblood still in it. I know, we all wrinkle our nose at that one. Within this category, we find smaller flying creatures, namely insects, described. Here, all flying insects are called unclean, and the Israelites are to detest them as a food source, with the exception of those that have jointed legs which propel them so they can leap or hop, such as locusts. Jumping flying insects are clean and so edible. All the rest are not. Now, as a general statement, the animals most considered unclean were either predators, it means they were unclean because they ate both the flesh and the blood of the animals, or they were scavengers. They were unclean because they were carriers of disease and they regularly contacted dead bodies. Okay, so as verses 2 through 23 covered which animals could or couldn't be eaten, verses 24 through 40 deal with the uncleanness or ritual impurity that comes from various animal carcasses and addresses the solution, the cure, if you will, to the problem. Please note that contact with a carcass results in uncleanness, not because such contact is in itself a sin, but because death and dying are the result of sin. They're a result of the curse, which carcasses glaringly represent. Generally speaking, the death of any creature contaminated it, making it unclean, and contaminating those who came into physical contact with it. There is only one way in which an animal can be killed in order for it to be clean, and that is to offer a designated clean animal as a sacrifice to God, which we'll see when we get to Leviticus 17. So there are 2 different situations with carcasses that make one unclean: touching and handling. Okay, so simply touching a carcass of various animals makes a person unclean until evening. But to those who pick up or handle one of those animal carcasses, it will make them unclean until evening, and they must also wash their clothes, which is an act we often see for cleansing impurity. And a side note for why one is unclean until evening. In Hebrew, the day started at sunset. We see this with the Jews' observance of the Sabbath, which begins at sundown Friday night and lasts until sundown Saturday. And this is based on the creation account in Genesis, where the Bible says, there was evening and there was morning. Don't you love how the Lord let the Israelites know they were ritually clean for the start of a new day? Verse 26. Verse 26 identifies unclean land animals whose carcasses, if touched, made one unclean. And not surprisingly, the animals which defile this way are those that don't meet the 2-pronged requirement of chewing the cud and having a split hoof. Verse 27 says those land animals which have paws and no split hoofs are unclean. Okay, verse 29 through 38 deals with uncleanness from contact with the carcasses of swarming land creatures. That is, those who multiply very quickly into groups. Okay, what animals are those? Again, scholars don't know exactly. Like the difficulty in knowing which flying creatures were referred to in verses 13 through 19, many of the Hebrew terms here are difficult to identify, but scholars note the list includes both reptiles and small mammals. Okay, so not only do the carcasses of these animals make people unclean, they also make various objects unclean if their body was on it. And the items listed here were really ordinary, everyday things found in the home or community. Now, depending on the object, there were different ways to make it clean again. Items made of wood or cloth would be cleansed by being put or dipped in water. Other items, however, such as clay pots or ovens, would have to be destroyed. This was inconvenient, but apparently it wasn't a hardship, as pottery was inexpensive and apparently easy to make. Food prepared with water from one of these clay pots that had a dead body on it or in it was also deemed unclean, as was any type of liquid found in the pot itself. Yet other things didn't become unclean at all, including springs and cisterns and piles of seeds which had not yet been planted. Scholars note these regulations underscored the seriousness of being unclean, yet they were sensitive to the realities of daily life, allowing the Israelites to keep those items that were the most time-consuming to produce or the most essential for the community's survival. Verses 39 through 40 refer to the clean land animals we spoke of in verse 3, the cudchu or split-hoofed animals. And as I said earlier, when these animals were killed for sacrifices, they didn't cause one to become unclean. And if a cudchu or split-hoofed animal died a natural death, they could be eaten, although the carcass made them unclean and the normal purification procedures had to be followed. Verses 41 through 43 make clear that the swarming creatures aren't to be eaten. It doesn't matter if they move on their belly, think snakes, walk on all fours, or walk on many feet. All were considered detestable as sources of food, and the Israelites were not to be defiled by them. Please note that in all the above-mentioned scenarios of uncleanness, no sacrifices were required because contact with these things weren't sins requiring forgiveness. They were a matter of ritual uncleanness or impurity only. Now, there's some idea of clean and unclean animals prior to Leviticus in the Bible. In Genesis 7, God told Noah to take 7 pairs of clean animals, a pair of each animal that isn't clean, and 7 pairs of birds with him in the ark. The fact that Noah was told to take 7 of each clean animal tells us he already knew of a distinction, of some division, that not all animals were to be treated the same. Now, whether this was God's working within the cultural context of Noah's day, as we've seen in other places, or if somehow before the law was given to Moses, and even before the flood, God had already instructed man that some animals were clean and others unclean, no one knows. So why did God classify some animals as clean and others clean? Scholars aren't sure. One explanation for the clean-unclean classification is hygiene. Animals may be considered unclean because they can potentially cause disease when eaten. For example, undercooked pork can cause trichinosis. But this explanation isn't foolproof, as we know many of the clean animals are equally dangerous if not cooked properly. For example, undercooked beef can transmit salmonella. A second explanation for the clean-unclean classification is that animals were categorized as clean because they were used in pagan worship or represented pagan gods. Now, this may have been true in some cases, but it too isn't fail-safe, as cattle, sheep, and goats were considered clean in Israel, yet were commonly sacrificed by pagans, and even the pagan god Pan shared many physical features of a goat. A third explanation is that an animal's behavior, this is my favorite, a third explanation is that an animal's behavior symbolically represents goodness, making them clean, or it represents evil and so makes them unclean. For example, it was believed in the 2nd century BC that chewing the cud made an animal clean because it reminded men to meditate on the law. While a 19th century AD belief was that the dirty habits of a pig spoke of the filth of iniquity. But again, these are at best opinions and so open to individual interpretation and therefore not a credible explanation. So all these explanations are guesses at best because the text doesn't tell us and God doesn't give his reasons. It may be that there isn't any reason at all other than God declared them clean or unclean. As one commentator argued, is there some reason why God chose Israel as opposed to the Canaanites? Did he choose the Israelites because they were spiritually pure? They weren't. Was it because they were powerful and numerous and looked promising and God wanted to go with a winning team? No. So why did God choose Israel and not some other nation? It was just God's sovereign choice. That's all. There was nothing intrinsically good about them or intrinsically more evil about anybody else. It wasn't a question of merit. God just made a choice, and God's choices are sovereign choices. So we don't know why God made these distinctions, but what we do know is that the function of these laws was to set the Israelites apart as a holy people. Okay, these dietary laws did mark them as separate. Today, if we see someone who doesn't eat meat, it's because they're a vegetarian. But in that ancient culture, to not eat the meat of impure animals was scandalous. Yet, it identified them as belonging to the Lord. We see this consecrating effect on display in the book of Daniel, where Daniel and his friends asked to be excused from defiling themselves from eating the non-kosher food at the king of Babylon's table. Okay, so a bit of background. Daniel and his friends were living in Jerusalem when the nation of Babylon conquered it, and they were carried off in exile. There, Daniel asked for a trial period to eat only vegetables and to drink only water. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And at the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. And as for these 4 youths, the Bible says, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in his kingdom. Daniel trusted God, obeying his food laws, and God blessed him. This is a beautiful example of Daniel honoring God and trusting the Lord would use it for his glory. And in doing so, Babylon, a Gentile nation, was blessed by Daniel and his friends' wisdom and understanding. It's important to note that these laws weren't a new way to God. It wasn't a system to earn divine favor. Israel already belonged to God. That happened with the Exodus, right? God had redeemed them then. He redeemed them first and then gave them commandments. It's the same here. They're to obey these laws because they belong to him. So dietary laws and ritual uncleanness served not only to bear witness to the widespread pollution of sin, but also to contrast the infinite holiness of God. And therefore, to the need for cleansing as a prerequisite to entering into his presence. Humans, by virtue of being part of this sin-cursed, fallen world, are unclean. We're contaminated and not automatically eligible to approach God. When God separated Israel from the nations, he separated Israel from the sinfulness of the nations so that a royal priesthood might emerge to serve as mediator between their holy God and the unclean nations. Leviticus 20, verses 23 through 26 says, "And you shall not walk in the customs of the nations that I am driving out before you, for they did all these things, and therefore I detested them. But I have said to you, you shall inherit their land, and I will give it to you to possess, a land flowing with milk and honey. I am the Lord your God who has separated you from the peoples. You shall therefore separate the clean beast from the unclean, and the unclean bird from the clean. You shall not make yourselves detestable by beast or by bird or by anything with which the ground crawls, which I have set apart for you to hold clean. You shall be holy to me, for I, the Lord, am holy and have separated you from the peoples, that you should be mine." The scholar Morales says, just as God had separated Israel from among the peoples, so Israel was to distinguish between clean and unclean animals in relation to food. Every meal was to serve as a reminder of God choosing Israel out of all the nations. But it also was to remind Israel of their call to keep themselves separate from the uncleanness of those nations, to be a holy people. The food laws then became a sign of Israel's identity and calling, a wall of separation between Israel and the nations. Israel had been chosen and cleansed, and with God's dwelling in their camp, they possessed a type of Eden in fullness of life. Conversely, all other nations remained exiled from his divine presence, unclean, and so in the realm of death. Okay, so now let me just talk about cleanness and uncleanness generally. According to Wenham, everything that's not holy is common. Common is either clean or unclean. Clean things can become holy when sanctified, but unclean things can't be sanctified. Clean things can become unclean if polluted or contaminated. Holy items can be defiled and become common, even polluted, and therefore unclean. Sanctification elevates the clean to holy, whereas contamination degrades the clean to unclean. Now, the desired goal is that the clean and the holy never come into contact with each other. Sacrifice, the gift God gave to the Israelites, can undo the effects of sin and human infirmity. Though sin and disease lead to the defiling of the holy and pollution of the clean, sacrifice can reverse the process. To be unclean is understood then as being excluded from the presence of God. It means you've come into contact with a substance that's brought you to the boundary between life and death. And when one touches things associated with death, you go from being pure to contracting uncleanness. Uncleanness is a lot like a contagion, something you contract by touching or eating or experiencing it, while being made clean means becoming fit for God's presence. This is why clean matters and why becoming unclean was a cause of distress to the ancient Israelites. Sin and pollution, if not atoned for and cleansed, would eventually lead to death, to permanent exile away from God's life-sustaining presence. Cleanliness is related to holiness. You've likely heard the adage, cleanliness is next to godliness. That's not in the Bible, actually, but we can see its application here. We see God repeated this idea twice at the end of chapter 11. Verses 44 through 45 says, "For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourselves with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." When we get down to the reason why the Israelites are to make these distinctions between clean and unclean, it's because God says, "You are to be holy, for I am holy." We hear this word holy and we don't know what to do with it. But when God says, "Be holy, for I am holy," he's referring to the specific, unique God of Israel, who's the source of all life, all being, all goodness, all beauty, and all light. The God of Israel is so generous that he wants to share all of these things with men. He's offering men, creatures who are other than God's own self, the opportunity to become connected to the very source of all these incredibly good things. Do we even grasp that? I know I don't, not really. Be holy, for I am holy. It means to be set apart, to be in the presence and service of God. He's offering the Israelites the proximity to draw near and be connected to his life-sustaining presence, on mission to restore the world by reflecting God's character, his love, his self-sacrifice, and his generosity in order to be a blessing to the world. So these food laws were meant to express the holiness of God in all aspects of their lives, not just in the sacrifice and offerings, and not just in their diets. One scholar said, God laid claim to the entire world and the entire person who lives in his world. The law recognized no sacred, secular distinction. The Old Testament regularly refers to clean and unclean to describe the moral purity the Israelites were to have, as well as the moral impurity they were to avoid. And likely you noticed an intensification within chapter 11 as it listed clean and unclean animals. The biblical author starts out with the creatures on the land, and we saw some were clean and others unclean. But when we get to the category of those animals that were in the water, it talked about them as detestable, saying, "And you shall detest their carcasses." Why? Because as one commentator aptly said, there's a sense in which one's emotions must come to agree with God's. Because you see, Because you see, God is calling the Israelites to obey, but more importantly, he's calling them to detest that which is unclean, to hate it. Why? Because he said so. That should be reason enough. It's not enough to say, I can eat this and I can't eat that. He wants them to say, these things are the things I can eat, and those other things, which God says I can't eat, I hate. I hate it because God has said it's not for me. It's off limits. Because God has always been after our hearts. He's about transforming our hearts by transforming our behavior. We have to have God's heart about these things. We cannot rightly relate to the unclean things until we hate them. When Eve looked at the forbidden fruit on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, she saw that it was pleasing to the eye and looked good to eat. She took it. God knows that if we look upon something as desirable that he has said is off limits, sooner or later, we'll take it. We'll eat it. Only when we look at the things God says are off limits as something utterly undesirable, that they're detestable, then we won't eat it. We won't want it. We won't take it. Okay, so I have this dog analogy. As I said earlier, we have two dogs. One named Ruby, because she's a gem, and the other, the non-cud chewer, is Gizmo. Now, both of them were trained exactly the same way. They both had the same instruction. But Gizmo represents those who seemingly obey the law, yet their heart isn't changed. She can curtail her behavior, her will, provided all the mechanisms, all the parameters are in place. No open doors for her to go darting through, no holes in the fence, no food left unintended, and someone home so she doesn't sit on the furniture. You get the picture. She knows the law of the household. She obeys the laws of the household. But remove any one of those mechanisms for obedience, and she's disobedient. Eating things that could be toxic, she's done that before. Breaking through fences and running in the road where she could get hit by a car. With Gizmo, there's a propensity for chaos and unrest because she doesn't trust that these protections and rules are for her good and given by those who love her and want her to flourish. Then there's Ruby. Sweet Ruby was rescued when she was about a year old. It took her several months to adjust to our household laws, but over time she came to see us as her people, her family. And if a dog can love, she loves us and really wants to please us. My husband Ian loves to sit in our backyard, and in our yard we have bunnies. Now Ruby loves to be outside with Ian, and she loves little furry creatures. She wants to hug and squeeze them. She really is so gentle. I don't think she intends them harm, but she's much bigger than they are. So when Ruby and Ian are outside and the bunnies are cud chewing our plants and flowers, Ian tells her to leave it. That's our law for don't hug the bunnies. You can see Ruby would like to hug the bunnies as her eyes lock, her ears twitch, and her muscles tense. But Ruby has learned to heed Ian's leave it. She's curtailed her desire, her will to chase the bunnies. Why? I believe it's because she desires to please Ian. She cares more about being in good stead and in a right relationship with him than she does about getting the bunny. She flourishes and is happiest when she pleases her master, trusting his good care for her. And her desire to please Ian also brings peace and blessing to the bunnies so that they too thrive and multiply. Okay, now this is a silly and a very imperfect analogy, but you get the point. This represents the Israelites' choice as well as ours. We're called not just to obedience, but so much more. to a relationship with the living God where when we live within his parameters and trust his goodness, we grow his kingdom, we bring his peace and his order to the world, and we push back at the effects of darkness and the curse. Again, God's laws weren't just about outward actions. They were about conforming hearts, conforming wills, and aligning them to his so as to be a light to the world. As God demonstrated his provision and care and protection throughout the Exodus, showing Israel he loved them as a groom loves his bride, he demonstrated his hesed, his loving kindness, which said, I know you, I love you, and I have good in store for you. And in return, he wanted them to trust and love him, pointing others to him to the one who redeems, who purifies and restores. In the New Testament, we see Jesus discussing this call to moral purity, to cleanness, in an encounter with some Pharisees and scribes who question why Jesus and his disciples aren't ceremonially washing their hands before eating. Now, washing your hands before meals is a good idea, and in the West, we typically observe it. But it wasn't an Old Testament law, and it's something the Jews added later to the interpretation and meaning of the laws. Their motivation here was wrong, as they were about ritual observance only and not devotion to the one who had redeemed them. In Matthew 15, Jesus correctly interprets God's law, quoting Isaiah saying, "This people gives me honor with their lips. Their heart, however, holds me at arm's length." The religious leaders, the very ones who were to help Israelites understand and apply God's law, were mired in legalism and ritual, as if checking off a box of tasks for the day, and so were missing the entire point of God's commands. Again, we see Jesus set aside ritual impurity or uncleanness and address the heart behind the command. The scholar Sklar states, the concept of ritual states, clean, unclean, and holy, was a cultural reality in ancient Israel that the Lord used to communicate his values. And we see Jesus interpreted these clean and unclean laws, underscoring the need for moral purity because God's values on it hadn't changed. In Matthew 15, Jesus continued his discussion of clean and unclean, saying, "Hear and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles a person. Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth passes into the stomach and is expelled? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." Jesus makes it clear it's not eating with unclean hands that's defiling. It's what comes it's what comes out that defiles, revealing unclean hearts. After Jesus' death and resurrection, we read in Acts 15 of the meeting of the Jerusalem Council. This was where Paul and Barnabas met with the disciples and elders to determine whether or not Gentile converts were made right with God by faith alone or by a combination of faith and obedience to the law of Moses. This issue was at the core of what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. Peter argued that God had already fully received the Gentiles. He said, "God, who knows the heart, bore witness to them by giving them the Holy Spirit, just as he did to us. And he made no distinction between us and them, having cleansed their hearts by faith." He added that if God had acknowledged these Gentiles as full partners in his work, then so should the church. Peter made an important observation which came straight from his vision of the clean and unclean animals detailed in Acts 10. There, God taught him that he shouldn't call any man common or unclean. The background to this was the Jews believed Gentiles were inherently unclean and could only be made clean by submitting to the law of Moses. But Peter showed how the heart was purified by faith, not by keeping the law. He argued that if a person were purified by faith, then there was no further need to be purified by submitting to ceremonies found in the law of Moses. According to Peter, all believers then, both Jew and Gentile, they're not only saved by faith, they are purified by faith. He concluded by asking, "Why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear?" He understood that from the beginning to the end, Israel could not bear the yoke of the law. We know this is true by looking at Israel's history. Even from the birth of the nation at Mount Sinai, they broke the law by worshiping the golden calf. And at the end of the Old Testament, we see that they broke the law by disregarding the Sabbath and marrying Gentile, non-God-fearing women. As one commentator said, they, meaning the Jews who wanted the Gentiles to submit to the law of Moses, looked at Israel's history under the law with eyes of nostalgia and not truth. If they had carefully and truthfully considered Israel's failure under the law, they wouldn't have been so quick to also put Gentiles under the law. And Paul made a similar argument in Galatians 3, saying, if the law doesn't save us, why would we return to it as the principle by which we live? He concludes saying, men are saved. They are sons of God by faith, by the finished work of Christ. Friends, Jesus' atonement and gift of the Spirit yields true cleansing both for the Jew and for the Gentile. Jesus came not to destroy the old religious system, but to build upon it. He came to finish the old covenant and establish the new. He came to reverse the curse and is restoring God's blessing for Israel and for all nations. We just saw at the Jerusalem Council that it was determined obedience to the laws of Moses wasn't required of the followers of Jesus, which by extension meant that the food laws were no longer necessary to observe. As Paul wrote in Colossians 2, so let no one judge you in food or in drink. Because Jesus won such a glorious victory on the cross, we aren't to let anyone judge us in food or in drink or in other matters related to legalism. We are to live a life centered on Jesus and what he accomplished on the cross. Though the food laws and their accompanying ritual purity laws, which we said weren't sinful and didn't require atonement, they've been set aside. The call to moral purity hasn't changed. The ritual purity laws taught the ancient Israelites over and over again that as much as God cared about ritual purity for his people, how much more did he care about moral purity? As believers, we remain called to hate sin, to hate what God hates and value what he values, because we still serve a holy God. Why does moral purity matter? Because we have a relationship with a holy God. Because moral impurity is always rooted in sin, which requires sacrifice and atonement. Jesus did that for us. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection allows us all entrance into God's holy presence. It wasn't my morally pure heart that brings me close. It was Jesus. But do I really reflect on what that means and then adjust my behavior to honor him? As the ritual purity laws were evidenced in the ancient Israelites' life, perhaps hour by hour, certainly daily, so too should holiness be the everyday, the every hour business in my decisions, in every decision that we make, in every response we give, and in all the things we do. Because our personal holiness and purity will affect our usefulness to our King. So then let me ask us all, how are the choices we make honoring God today? Am I willing to forgo my desires so as to honor God above everything else? And how by our actions are we interceding on behalf of the lost? These are the things that we do in order to live as a kingdom of priests and a blessing to the nations, consecrated to glorifying King Jesus. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, you are good. You alone are good. You alone are holy. Lord, I pray that we would understand what great lengths you have gone to redeem us and to restore us. That you would give us understanding to know what holy means and what you desire for us. And how Jesus bridged that gap. He took our uncleanness and made us clean. And so we can now draw near to you, Lord. Lord, I pray that each of us would make the sacrifices necessary to remain holy, to remain a people of God that is a blessing to the nations. Father, this is for your glory and for our good. In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.